There is a question that sounds impossible until you meet the people who answered it every single year. How do you keep a newborn child alive for 5 straight months in a place where the air itself is trying to kill you? Not in comfort, not behind modern walls or electric heat, but out on the open Mongolian steppe, where the temperature can fall to 50 degrees below zero, and the wind carries a cold so violent that bare skin can freeze in under 2 minutes. This is a land where water turns to ice beside the fire, where steel grows brittle and cracks in the dark, and where a single wrong decision does not simply make you uncomfortable, it makes you dead. Most of us experience winter as an inconvenience. The Mongols experienced it as an enemy, and not a mindless one. The cold out here behaves almost like something alive, patient enough to wait, and clever enough to find the one weakness you forgot to protect. It does not want to kill you quickly. It wants to wait, and let you make one small mistake. So picture a young mother on the first great storm of the season, holding an infant against her chest inside a small circle of felt and wood, while the entire world outside dissolves into white. The fire is already low, the night has barely begun, and the winter ahead is longer than the child has been alive. By the time spring finally returns to these grasslands, will that child still be breathing? For centuries, the answer was yes, again and again, and it had almost nothing to do with luck, and nothing to do with a single miracle invention either. The answer was something outsiders looked at and dismissed as little more than a simple tent. They were wrong. It was one of the most intelligent survival machines ever built. To a stranger seeing one for the first time, it looked temporary, fragile, almost primitive, and that illusion lasted only until the first blizzard arrived. What outsiders lazily called a tent, the Mongols called a gur, and the name matters, because Yurt is a word borrowed from their Turkic and Russian neighbors, while ger is the word the people themselves used for the home they carried across the roof of the world. And almost nothing about it was accidental. The first piece of intelligence was the shape. Modern buildings trap cold in their corners, where the air goes still and frost begins to crawl inward. But the ger had no corners at all. Wind flowed around its curved walls instead of slamming into them, and inside, the warmth circled endlessly around the central fire, rather than dying in some frozen pocket in the back of the room. The structure did not fight the storm so much as move with it. Its wooden lattice frame, called the kana, was built to flex, because in this kind of cold, rigid things grow brittle and snap, while the ger bent under the weight of snow and wind, and let that force travel around its circular body like pressure through the spokes of a wheel. Over that frame came the felt, layer upon layer of compressed sheep's wool, trapping thousands of tiny pockets of air in exactly the way a modern insulated coat does today. But insulation alone was never the real genius. The real genius was moisture, because at 50 below, water is the assassin no one sees coming. Every breath, every pot of boiling soup, every sleeping body pours invisible vapor into the air, and in a sealed shelter, that vapor freezes onto the walls as a growing shell of ice that drains heat faster than any fire can replace it. The felt of the ger let that vapor breathe its way out before it could turn to frost, and on the ancient steppe, staying dry was the difference between living and dying. Even the door obeyed the logic of survival, almost always facing south, away from the killing winds that poured down out of Siberia to the north, so that every time someone stepped in or out, the cold could not reach straight into the heart of the home. But the most perfect shelter on earth is nothing more than a beautifully built freezer the moment the fire inside it dies. And here the Mongols faced a problem that would break most modern survivors in a single night. The steppe had almost no trees. There were no forests to cut, no wood piles to stack, nothing a person raised on firewood would even recognize as fuel. So they turned to the one thing the land produced without end: dung. Dried horse, cattle, yak, and sheep dung, called argle, became the burning heart of winter, gathered patiently through summer and autumn, and piled in sheltered heaps long before the first hard freeze arrived. To outsiders this sounds like desperation, but it was closer to engineering, because think about what that dried dung really was. All summer the grass drank in sunlight, the animals ate the grass and turned it into flesh and milk and waste, and that waste dried hard beneath the steppe sun into fuel, which means that on the coldest night of the year, a Mongol family was quite literally burning the captured sunlight of a summer that had vanished months before beneath the snow. Unlike wood, argle existed everywhere the herds existed, and well-dried it burned slow and steady, hot enough to melt snow into water and coax thin strips of meat into soup, and its smell was not the stench people imagine, but a dry, earthy smoke that a child came to link with the deepest feeling of all warmth and safety and the promise of morning. But morning was exactly where the danger lived, because the most fragile moment of the whole day came just before dawn, when the fire had sunk to almost nothing. Each night, the family buried the glowing embers under a blanket of ash to keep them breathing until first light, and picture that same young mother again, waking in the blue dark before anyone else, leaning close to the ashes and breathing softly onto them, drawing a single thread of orange back to life, because if those embers died completely, rebuilding a fire in a sub-zero wind could cost the family time and heat and strength that none of them could spare. That is why the Mongols treated the hearth flame almost like a living spirit, and it was far more than superstition. To put out the fire in another family's home was once a grave taboo, an act that struck at life itself, because the flame at the center of the jar was never merely heat. It was survival, handed carefully from one generation to the next, kept alive on nights when the entire world outside had frozen solid. And that fire existed to do more than warm the body. It existed to cook the food that kept the body burning, and the food of the steppe was built around one brutal question: how do you pull the most survival out of every single calorie? Their answer began with borts, thin strips of lean meat hung outside in the dry, freezing air until the winter itself turned them hard as wood and light as paper, meat that could last for months and be carried in a saddlebag for weeks, then dropped into boiling water or milk to bloom back into a rich, hot broth, using almost no precious fuel at all. Around that they built a diet the modern world would flinch at, and the steppe could not live without fat, marrow, tail fat, and clarified butter, dense and heavy, because a body fighting 50 below burns through thousands of calories just to stay warm, and the organ meats carried the vitamins that plain muscle could not. Nothing was ever wasted. Blood became sausage, bone became broth, milk became butter and curds and drink. Every part of the animal folded back into the survival of the people. And that points to the deepest truth of this whole world. Because to us, livestock is property, but to the Mongols, the herd was infrastructure. It was transportation, food, fuel, clothing, and even a warning system, all of it walking beside them on 4 legs. The horses could sweep the snow aside, with their hooves to reach the frozen grass beneath, surviving where softer foreign breeds simply died. In a storm, animals were sometimes gathered upwind of the camp so that their bodies became a living wall against the gale, dozens of them clustered together, throwing off real, measurable heat. Sheep gave the wool that became the felt of the gur, and in the harsh mountain cold the yak gave milk so rich in fat that ordinary cattle could never have matched it. Even the animals' behavior became a kind of forecast, horses turning their backs to the wind or sheep refusing to graze, warning of a storm still hours away. But an endless winter of meat and fat hides a slower killer, one that once wiped out entire crews of sailors on long voyages. Scurvy, the sickness of a body starved of fresh life, where the gums bleed and the teeth loosen and the strength quietly drains away. The Mongols met it with fermentation, above all with airag, mare's milk fermented into a mildly sour, mildly alcoholic drink carrying nutrients, living cultures, and just enough vitamin C to hold that darkness at bay through half a year without a single green plant. And yet all of it, the jar, the fire, the meat, the milk, the herd hung together by a single thread, because on the steppe one bad season could pull the entire system down at once. The Mongols even had a name for that nightmare. The Dzud, a winter so savage that it could kill millions of animals in a matter of weeks, burying the grass under ice the horses could no longer break, and a family that lost its herd lost everything in the same breath: its food, its fuel, its clothing, its walls. It still happens to this day, out on those same grasslands, which is exactly why survival here was never something a person could do alone. And this is where the deepest law of the steppe reveals itself, because to turn a freezing stranger away from your fire was very nearly to commit murder, and so the people almost never did. A traveler who arrived out of the storm was let in, warmed, and fed, no matter who they were, because everyone understood that one day the stranger at the door might be you. Survival, in the end, was not a private act. It was a promise the whole steppe made to itself. And that is why the true enemy of winter was never really the cold at all. It was despair, the slow erosion of the will to rise before dawn and breathe on the embers one more time. The Mongols answered it with something quieter than courage. Discipline became warmth. Routine became safety. Community became the insulation that kept hopelessness from freezing a family from the inside out. They did not conquer nature. They learned how to fit inside it, until the fire, the felt, the herd, and the human hands that tended all three became a single living system where everything depended on everything else. So think back, one last time, to that young mother on the first night of the storm, breathing life into the ashes while her child slept against her chest. When spring finally returned and the grass broke green through the melting snow, the child was still breathing, as children had been, on these plains for 1,000 years. We like to believe our strength comes from our technology, from the power to hold nature at arm's length. But the Mongols understood something older and far wiser, that we were never strongest when we stood apart from the world that fed us. We were strongest when we belonged to it. If stories like this stay with you, the forgotten brilliance hidden inside how our ancestors survived, then follow along. Because history is stranger, harsher, and far more ingenious than we were ever taught.